They laughed as she crossed the street. Nobody in the crowd had any idea that the woman tucking a tiny blanket into the crook of her arm held two lives that traced back to the most dangerous man in the city. Vincent Moretti watched from the back seat of a blacked-out Rolls, rain streaking the armored glass into silver furrows. He was supposed to be elsewhere, a dinner with Natasha booked, decisions waiting, deals that required his signature. Instead, he allowed himself the selfish indulgence of watching the pedestrian tide along Michigan Avenue, the blur of umbrellas and neon reflecting in his suit's satin shoulder. Then he saw the woman. Memory stopped being a story and became a stone dropped into his chest. She moved like someone half asleep with a burden, head bowed against the drizzle, cheeks hollow in that soft, exhausted way of a person who had given every hour to someone smaller than them. 2 bundles of knit cloth rested against her chest. One of the bundles made an almost inaudible noise, a small high waggle that might have been a cough, might have been a hiccup. People smiled and stepped around her. A man with a briefcase nudged past with apologies that sounded like wind. Vincent's hands tightened on the leather seat. Close up, behind the glass, he noticed the tiredness in the angle of her shoulders, the dark circles that no concealer could hide, the way one tiny fist clenched and unclenched inside a mitten that was too big. He had seen that fist before. He had never seen both of those mittens. He had not known. Not then. Not when he'd left. The name at the back of his throat uncoiled to the front. Scarlet. He had left for reasons that felt, at the time, like armor. A rival power had tipped a knife into his life and told him what would happen to anyone who remained tethered to the war between them. He made a choice then, and he had told himself it was protection. It was easy to phrase it as duty. It was harder to feel it as anything but abandonment when the consequences surfaced in the midst of the city's indifferent crowd. Scarlet kept walking. He watched her cross under the blinking hand of the pedestrian signal. A teenager laughed at a stumble that will never be filmed in his mind without sound. Behind him, his driver lowered the window an inch, as if to ask for an order. Vincent only gave the quietest shake of his head, as if saying he needed time. He had not meant to look. He had not meant to unravel. But a fossil of memory is enough to set a life grinding on a new axis. At home that night, the house that bore the name Moretti on the glass of one wing, decor that was careful about not overstating itself, Vincent found himself pushed between worlds. Natasha waited across the table, poised in a dress that had been chosen to make him feel more visible than she did. Her laughter arrived as currency. She used it to buy the attention of the room. Vincent returned with nods and a practiced half-smile. Under the tablecloth his hands trembled, a new, secret tremor he did not show. He thought of the tiny shoe he had glimpsed. He thought of the way Scarlet had tucked the blanket against the baby's nose. He pictured a name scratched on a hospital bracelet. His phone vibrated, a square of light that he had ordered the men to keep dark at dinner. He turned it briefly, ignoring the moment. The message was from Marco. File ready. He excused himself and went to the stairwell, where the house's sound softened. Marco's face on the secure line was a thing Vincent had built his life on, efficient, unflinching. But tonight there was a small fissure. The men who worked at the edges of Vincent's world were instructed to close ranks, to make the dangerous seem ordinary. Marco's voice carried none of that tonight. "Her name is Scarlett Morgan," Marco said. He let the words fall like proof. "She had twins, boy and girl, born early. Hospital bills shit after insurance didn't cover." Vincent closed his eyes. He tried to pull the memory away, to stop himself from being a man in a suit with a sudden, stupid wish that the past might be reversed. But he had never been naive enough to believe in erasure. He summoned the file code. The file opened on his phone in a cramped font of cold facts. Dates, diagnoses, phone numbers. Scarlett's ultrasound was there, a black and white miracle like the ghost of a lifetime. On the document his name hovered, not as ownership but as a biological foothold. Leo Vincent Morgan, Luna Rose Morgan. Her naming choices had been a kind of quiet accusation and a rebuke, binding him in print. 14 months. The file told the timeline with the precision of a ledger that had no heart. 14 months she'd been moving through the city, a small mother with twin cocooned in layers of thrifted sweaters, and the kind of dignity that didn't advertise itself. Hospital bills threaded into debt collectors' letters. A landlord's notice was stapled to an eviction warning. There were notes about hospital visits and scarred wrists from late-night work. There was a line that made Vincent's chest go cold. "Cut off by order of Moretti family." Marco swallowed. "I did the order, boss. It was—" He stopped, searching for penalties that would make the pain less. Vincent felt the old systems of rightness and responsibility buckle like old scaffolding. For years the code had been a map: stay out, disappear, protect. Marco had followed orders in a way that had been expected, yet the order had not been just a strategic maneuver. It had been a decision about a person, about a woman who had loved him and a child who was his. "Why?" Vincent asked. The word was smaller than the feeling that loomed behind it. Marco's apology didn't use the word. He offered reasons instead: threats on the Moretti name, a rival's insistence, the danger of tethers. He told of a phone call from Blackwood that had been thinly disguised as advice. He said that Natasha had made her displeasure clear about any soft spots. He anticipated the glance Vincent would give toward the table, and the expensive echo of Natasha's laugh. "You ordered it because you thought you were protecting her," Marco admitted. "You said if she was tied to you, she was at risk. I followed the instruction. I cut communications. I pulled whatever we had. I'm sorry." Vincent listened to the clock on the wall of the stairwell and felt the slow, inevitable shift of earthquake at his feet. Protection was a mask they had both worn in that moment. Abandoned had been the truth for the woman in the rain. He thought of the fists, the tiny mitten. He thought of a boy with his name. If Blackwood knew? Marco's voice was a question poised at the brink of accusation. He mentioned knowing about anything. He's been sniffing. Vincent's throat tightened. Blackwood had always been an animal that smelled fear like blood. If the rival knew the children existed, and had reason to use them, the life of the woman who had been his could be the lever Blackwood needed. "Bring me everything," Vincent said. The voice he used now wasn't the cool brand he wore in the city's rooms. It was simpler, blunt, edged in something that might have been guilt. "All correspondences, all debts, names, show me the hospital." He did not sleep that night. He paced in a room that knew too many secrets. He had made a decision once, one that had seemed like armor. Now armor felt like a cage. At the center of every equation that mattered to him was a small person who had been named after him. He had been at the table where the choice was made, and now he would have to be at the table where the consequences were paid. Across town, Scarlett Morgan handled the week with a kind of practical refusal to be undone. She moved through chores and shifts like a woman with a map of necessary tasks that left little room for error. Her apartment smelled like boiled bottles and the faint, bitter tang of laundry detergent. A calendar on the fridge was smattered with grocery lists and a circled date, the hospital's payment plan deadline. She had learned to ration everything to the smallest increments. Formula mixed by the milliliter, naps taken in the precise rhythms that worked around the night job, doctor appointments scheduled in between overnight shifts. Scarlett had not wanted to be a spectacle. She kept a dignity that did not ask for pity. When she pushed a stroller along the sidewalk, she did it with an invisible armor of practicality. When a neighbor offered a second-hand crib and a bag of clothes, she accepted with gratitude and forgot to mention to anyone the worry that sat like a stone in her throat at night. She remembered the night the sonogram had been printed in grainy black and white, and she had pressed the thin rectangle to her chest as if it were a talisman. She had whispered a name into the fluorescent hum of a hospital room when no one had been listening. Leo. She had chosen Luna for the girl because of an old woman who had once taught her to sew and had smiled like pity and love at the same time. Her hands had learned to be efficient. She could do a dozen small things while holding a baby: signing a paper, stirring a pot, answering a work call. She could comfort with one arm and bargain with bosses with the other. There was a strength in that decision-making quality that had surprised even herself. If survival had been an art, she had an eye for color. On nights when the twins slept badly and the world seemed particularly thin, Scarlett sat on the couch and counted the ways she had been left alone. She did not imagine an intervention, nor did she hold to fantasies of being rescued. Her decisions were rooted in reality. Keep the kids safe, keep the bills paid, make sure they had enough food to grow. Relationships were a luxury that came with risks. She had learned to weigh every affection against the ledger of consequences. In the margin of that ledger, the name Vincent lived like an unasked-for annotation. It was not until Marco's man with a discreet card arrived at her clinic street that Scarlett realized someone had taken an interest beyond the transactional. The envelope contained a terse note and a stack of paid receipts, payments made in full that erased a months-long debt. No signatures, no explanations, just the thin metallic thrum of an offer. Care without strings, or so the papers said. She stared at the receipts until the lamp on the bedside table burned her eyes. She should have been elated, at least relieved. Instead, she felt a hollowing, relief but with the taste of betrayal. She folded the paper into the drawer and went to change a diaper, hands turning as muscle memory demanded. She thought of the night she'd sat in a different hospital bed and heard someone else suggest she give up the child for safety. She had said no then. She would say no now. Then her phone rang. The name on the screen made her heart stumble before she could stop it. Vincent. She nearly let it ring out. She had promised herself a boundary, the unbending kind of line that survivors draw with blunt instruments. Let sleeping ghosts lie, but curiosity is a dangerous, necessary thing. Scarlett. His voice was different in the phone, smaller, as if gravity lived in the spaces between his words. I don't have much time. Are the children with you? She could hear the hospital smells through the line, his voice cutting across the distance like light. She wrapped one of the babies closer and tapped the other's cheek to soothe a whimper. Yes, she said. She kept it brief. They're fine. You don't have to answer me, he said. I found out. I want to help. She put the phone on the coffee table and let the twins burble over her thigh. Part of her wanted to hang up then and there. Part of her wanted to ask why it had taken him this long. She had lived long enough to know that no good came from the mythology of grand gestures. Help is expensive, she said finally, because she had to say something true. And help from you costs more than money. There was a long silence. The city outside hummed like a far-off engine. I'll pay the hospital in full, he said at last. I'll make sure the collector is gone. I'll do it quietly. Scarlett's hand picked up the ultrasound photo and smoothed the edges. The name she had written on the back blurred under pressure of her thumb. Leo, then Luna. A childish scrawl that was now a history. What else? She asked. It was as much a shield as a question. I can provide protection, he said. For a while. Short term, until this blows over. I don't want any appearances, no grand statements, just safety. She laughed, a small sound that the baby above her mistook for play, and began to kick. You walked away because you thought it would keep us safe, she said. Who are you to decide that safety now? Vincent did not answer right away. He could have countered with the old justifications, the reasoning that had sounded like courage when he convinced himself of it in private. He could have said that leaving had been the only way to keep enemies from finding them. He could have told her of Blackwood's teeth and the way his enemies chewed through smaller lives when they wanted leverage. Instead, he let himself be honest in a way he had not practiced in years. I thought I was protecting you, he said. I was wrong. That admission was not an absolution. It was a beginning, which was all he could offer at that moment. Scarlett's face, down the line, was unreadable. She closed the phone and picked one of the babies up to check a diaper. He watched her in the small borrowed window of the call, and thought of the crosswalk, of the way the world treated her like background. He felt, suddenly and acutely, like a man who had finally seen the color of his failure. When he arrived at the hospital in the middle of an afternoon rain, he did it without entourage. The driver waited at a discreet distance. Vincent walked in with a plain coat and a hood that made him look like any other man from a certain angle. He disliked being anonymous. He disliked permission even more. He wanted to move in and solve, like the rest of his life had taught him to do. But the hospital lobby had a smell of disinfectant and tired coffee, and Scarlett was alone in a corner with a bassinet she was coaxing to sleep. She looked up when he approached, and for a moment his muscles forgot the rest of his plan, and only registered the familiar. There were so many small details he had stored, the freckle near her eyebrow, the callus at the side of her thumb where she had sewn too many buttons by hand. Seeing her with the twins made him feel as if he had been erased from a work of art and then reinserted by a clumsy hand. Vincent, she said. Her voice was steady. The twins quieted as if they knew the sound of the name, but they had not known him for most of their lives. Their eyes were still the color of infancy, a pull to the center. He sat without being asked. This was not a place for dramatics. He had learned long ago that feeling often misplaces itself when presented in public. I paid the hospital, he said. The words were both simple and fraught with 1,000 meanings. I'll take care of the debt. She snorted softly, more disbelief than amusement. Is that why you walked away? Because you wanted to keep us safe? You paid the bills and left us to fight every other charge. She had a right, he knew, to be furious. He had a responsibility to be humble. He was surprised at the sting that tightened his throat. You can say that, he said, but I never wanted you in harm's way. I thought, I thought if I removed myself, I could move the danger away. If that's cowardice, then I accept it." Her eyes flicked to his face and back to the babies. "Did you ever think maybe you should have told me? Maybe come back and tell me what was happening instead of making me believe it was my fault? I thought you being untied from me would be the safest plan." "You thought wrong," she said. It was not a cruel verdict. It was a statement of fact, like the hospital bill that would have come due next week if he had not intervened now. "Why now?" he swallowed. "I was told there's interest in the children," he said. The word slid out like a stone into water. Blackwood knows. It had the effect he had intended. Scarlett's fingers tightened on the blanket. The baby in her arms fussed, sensing the change. "You have enemies," she said. She was not naive. The city, to her, was a place one navigates by instinct and the law of thorough observation. "You always have enemies." Blackwood's name arrived like a winter wind. Even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer when it was uttered. Vincent told her what he knew, that Blackwood had been assembling information, that intelligence had suggested the rival might use the existence of children as a lever. He did not paint himself as noble. He had made plenty of morally ambiguous decisions, but he told the truth as he could. Scarlett listened like someone cataloging evidence. She asked pointed questions about arrangements, about whether there would be witnesses, about custody paperwork. She tested him on whether this offer of safety came with strings, conditions, or an expectation that she would vanish from her life and accept a gilded cage. "You'll help me," she said finally. "If I come, I decide the terms. I'm not—" She searched for the word that didn't sound like defeat. "I'm not a thing to be moved into a better-looking room." Vincent heard the steel in her voice, and, for the first time since seeing her at the crosswalk, he felt naked. He had not come to buy forgiveness. He had come because a parent's instinct, perhaps the last honest part of him, demanded it. "No conditions except safety," he said. "I will not force you to be anything. I will not make choices for the children." She held his gaze as if testing the veracity of the sentence, the grammar of a man who had lived by commands and now offered a softer syntax. Finally, after a long minute, she agreed to temporary protection. She named terms. She would keep controlling access to her children. She would not be paraded. She would have private time with the babies free of men in suits. "You allowed me to make the decision," she said. "I made one. I'm choosing safety. For now." He promised. He had nothing else of value to trade for the faith she was granting. He was grateful for small mercies. Marco arranged discreet transport. A car without insignia arrived at the curb. The driver's hands were steady. The ride to the estate was an awkward silence. Two people flanking a trust that had not yet learned to exist in the same room. On the drive, Vincent thought of Natasha, of her small domination over his life. She did not allow for cracks. She would not see this as a humanitarian mission. She would see it as a betrayal. He tried to think ahead to the conversation that would follow, what she would say and, importantly, what she would do. Scarlett closed her eyes against the rhythm of the highway. The babies slept in their car seats, breathing like a concordant music in the back. For all the rusted edges of her life, she held to a belief in the smallness of daily tasks and the power in them. Being here, in a car bound for a house with guards and heavy doors, unnerved her. At the same time, it made the looming danger feel almost cartoonish, as if being inside the Moretti walls would be the only way to see the real teeth of her world. When they arrived, the house swallowed them in a different kind of quiet. Rooms dressed for negotiation, but now offering, oddly, a possibility for rest. The estate smelled of wood polish and rain. A woman with a professional smile. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor Vincent had quietly placed as a sort of house guardian for the family, waited with a tray of tea. She had a way of folding grief and hope into a single movement, and she took the babies as if they were the most ordinary thing in the world. The gesture made Scarlett feel both absurd and, strangely, grounded. Vincent kept his distance in the beginning. He hovered like a man unused to filial tasks. When one of the babies woke and began to cry, he found himself moving before he had consciously decided to. An old reflex itched in his hands, the muscle memory of a man who once knew how to command rooms and now had to quiet a child. Mrs. Chen handed him a bottle with a small, knowing smile. His fingers fumbled with the nipple, the cap, the rattle of the wrapper. Scarlett watched. "You don't have to do that," she said, not unkindly. She had said much harder things to him already. This was not in that catalog. "I want to," he said. If there's one thing I can do right now, it's this. He fed the baby awkwardly, but with a concentration that bordered on reverence. The infant's lashes fluttered, the little mouth closed around the rubber with a fierce, tiny grip. For a breath, the house felt like a different kind of kingdom. One where he could be powerful without threatening lives, where success meant the simple achievement of burping a baby without causing a fuss. The baby let out a small belch and then relaxed against his chest. Vincent's shoulders unclenched in a way he had not planned. The arrival of the more public world was never far. Nights unfolded with Vincent trying to find the grammar of fatherhood, Scarlett setting the terms, and Marco delivering concise updates about the heat the rival might be bringing. Natasha, of course, learned of the arrangement. She was not a woman to be slighted with silence. She called him twice in the first 24 hours, her questions first sharp and then venomous. By the time the second evening had bled into night, he could feel her radar sweeping the house like a hawk. "Why would you do this without telling me?" she demanded on the phone, the sound of perfume through a line. "I had to move quickly," he said. "There's information that Blackwood—" "You made decisions for her before," she said. "And now you come crawling back? It's a humiliation." Vincent said nothing for a second, and then said, with an honesty he was still unfamiliar with, "I was wrong." That admission, once again, did not mollify her. It enraged her. Her response was swift and frosty. Alliances are brittle when pride is broken. The world they inhabited tolerated no perceived weakness for long. Natasha's colors were bright and dangerous, and in the private rooms of her life, she made plans that had nothing to do with mercy. Across town, under the cold neon of a diner that knew too many secrets, Natasha met a man with a lighter step and thinner promises. He smelled of cologne and certainty. His name was Blackwood. He offered her a grin that was all teeth and a plan that promised to be useful. She showed him the photographs she had made of Vincent at the hospital, of Scarlett's small movements in the estate. He listened, and his eyes promised collision. When Scarlett slipped into bed the first night at the Moretti estate, she kept the chain of small rules she had always used. She would not be paraded. She would not be used. She had agreed to protection on terms that kept her agency intact. She believed in the reasonableness of that decision, because the alternative had been to let fear shape every choice. Vincent stood outside the nursery for a long while, hands in pockets, watching the two small lives breathe in the dim light. He thought of the crosswalk, of the way people laughed at a woman who was invisible by choice of the world. He thought of what he had cost her, and how the smallest acts now, bedtime stories, feeds, paying off debt, might heal the gouge he'd left. There was no easy redemption, there was only work. He was beginning to learn how to do the work. The house settled into an uneasy routine. In quiet pockets, small connections stored up like coins. When he changed a diaper with an inelegant concentration, Scarlett would roll her eyes and then laugh without irony. When she insisted on handling the twins' bathing herself, Vincent waited by the towels and learned the rhythms of a world in which power was given away in 1,000 tiny ways. He paid the bills in the morning and made sure the collection letters were all gone, the accounting for a life she could not afford to lose. But even as they folded into this dysfunctional intimacy, danger circled. Blackwood was not a man to be mollified by statements of safety. He preferred to extract power with theater and leverage. In the shadows of his dealings, the knowledge that Vincent had a personal stake, children, became a possible means for humiliation or worse. Natasha's alliance with him was not yet formalized, but the air was charged with the velocity of betrayal. Marco, for his part, moved between loyalty and penance. He visited hidden corners of the city where debts were collected, where men whispered and the price of a life could be negotiated for the right amount of money or information. He had made one grievous error. Now his acts would either stitch a wound or fray it further. He had begun to prove his change, not in speeches but in small dangerous actions. A guard redirected, a phone tapped, the neutralization of a loose thread. Change, in his world, was measured in risk. Night drew over the estate like a blanket that was never big enough to cover everything. In rooms behind closed doors, someone was making deals that would hold consequences like knives. Vincent knew he could not undo every wrong with money or apologies. He also knew that doing nothing had already been his choice once, and the cost of that choice had been etched across a city in the tired lines of Scarlett's face. Outside, a thunderstorm rode in on the lake wind. The rain tapped at the windows in a staccato. Between two rooms, two lives tried on new roles, testing seams. Each footstep in the house echoed with the possibility of something else entirely. loyalty broken, alliances redrawn, protection that might not hold. For now, the babies slept, breathing like small engines. Vincent sat back in a chair, hands clasped, and felt the first honest, terrifying responsibility of a father who had once thought power was the same as safety. He would have to learn how to keep them safe without becoming the same man who had torn their lives apart. He would need to prove himself over and over. He would need to take risks that had no certainty of payoff. The storm outside was only beginning. The real tempest would be bearing down from inside rooms where plans were made, and from men who believed in leverage above love. When the rain finally let up, the city outside exhaled a neon sigh. Inside the estate, the night stretched long. Vincent closed his eyes for a breath and, for the first time, allowed himself a childish hope that perhaps the smallest, most ordinary days could be the measure of a man. He did not know yet whether that hope was arrogance or grace. He simply knew it was the only way forward. And in a dim corner of a room not far from where the babies slept, a woman named Natasha frowned over her phone as she typed a message that would change everything. She sent it to a number that belonged to a man who had been waiting for the exact moment where the most dangerous man in Chicago might finally show his weakness. The reply was immediate and cold. Understood. The reply on Natasha's phone was a single word that felt like a detonator. Understood. When she sent it, the light from the screen carved angles into her face. Her lips tightened into a line that had no room for softness. Across town, Blackwood set his jaw and let the city's chill seep into his bones like ink. Plans do not move unless someone pulls the strings. Natasha, eager and bright with spite, had handed him one. Inside the Moretti estate, an ordinary evening continued. Low voices over a crossword, the sound of a kettle undone, the twins, snug and small, breathing soft as tides. Mrs. Chen hummed in the kitchen while Scarlett stacked bottles, focused and methodical, turning labor into love. Vincent sat at the table, palms steepled, listening to Marco's report on the phone. They both knew the sound of danger even when it came wearing a suit of civility. "Blackwood's been listening," Marco said. "He's made a few inquiries. He'll want leverage. He knows there's familial. He just doesn't have names or faces yet." Vincent felt the old machinery of dread, the part of him that smelled strategy before fear, wake up. It wanted to fix, to strike, to burn the problem away. He had always been able to buy solutions, silence a voice, erase a paper, pay off a debt. But this problem was woven through the bodies of 2 children and a woman who had already been broken by his absence. If he made the wrong choice now, he wouldn't just lose a fight, he would lose them. "It's not enough to threaten," Marco added. "He wants spectacle. He'll make you watch." Vincent's jaw tightened. The words didn't scare him, they horrified him. Blackwood did not fight for territory so much as for humiliation. He liked to set examples that made men smaller in the eyes of others. To exploit Scarlett would be both humiliation and punishment. Vincent thought of a small fist curled inside a mitten and felt his latest armor, the fragile, slow responsibility of a father, pull taut. "We increase security 24/7, Vincent said. "No public movements without clearance. Rotate routes. Keep Mrs. Chen on shift near the nursery. I want Tony cleared. Do a sweep of everyone on staff." Marco hesitated. "Tony's been here a long time. He's a steady hand." "Then verify his steadiness," Vincent said. "I don't want family inside this house unless I've checked their pockets." Scarlett listened with a controlled distaste. She had agreed to safety on terms. She had been clear she would not be moved as a trophy or a proof of ownership. She watched the men the way someone reads a list of possible dangers and then files them in the proper drawer. There was a fierceness in her that had nothing to do with gratitude. She was protective by instinct and defiance. Vincent met her gaze across the table and felt, in that small human exchange, how far the distance ran between them. He wanted to say everything, apologize until language had no more power, explain the choices he'd called courage years ago. He kept it small. He fed the babies, changed diapers with fumbling reverence, learned how to soften his voice with lullabies he'd never sung. The house settled, and like all settled things, it had corners where the light didn't reach. Natasha's message had planted a seed. Blackwood and his men began to unspool the threads that Natasha had offered. A security guard with a gambling debt, a driver with a softened conscience, a night shift worker on painkillers. Blackwood's men moved like predators sniffing for soft patches. He offered money and reprisal with the same steady, oily smile. Tony, who had always had a habit of doing favors for the right amount, answered questions he shouldn't have, slippage that looked like small things until it became a map. There are betrayals that cut like knives, and betrayals that are more like rot. Small compromises, rationalizations, the belief that one favor to the right person will not lead to fire. Tony began to think of his mortgage and the medical bills for an aging sister. He began to talk. He began to make excuses. He told himself there would be no blood. Blackwood had given assurances, demonstrations, not threats. He saw Natasha's anger from a distance and let it feel like a currency he could use. It was a quiet betrayal at first, a night shift worker leaving a gate unsecured, a delivery man arriving at odd hours, a guard dosed with something that dulled reaction times. The estate's cameras recorded everything, but Blackwood paid well for blind spots. For all the bristling security, a man with cash and the right degree of shame could find a way to the soft places. The night the house changed forever began unremarkably. Rain tapping the driveway, the twins asleep under layers of blankets, Mrs. Chen knitting by the fire. Scarlett had gone to bed with one baby still at her breast, eyes closed in the sort of exhaustion that felt like a living thing. Vincent walked the halls, checking locks he'd checked an hour before. He loved the ordinary noises of this house, the little squeak one stair made under another weight, the low rustle of a curtain, the way the refrigerator hummed in time with a sleeping infant's breath. At 2:13 a.m., an alert blinked on a console in a room Marco used like a war room. An internal comms channel flashed a red message. Perimeter breach. Service entrance. Marco moved with the speed of someone who had lived in sudden danger for years. He called, ordered, cajoled. Guards reached for rifles. Tony, who had promised to be loyal until the end, was in the guard post and sent a terse, panicked SMS. "They're here, please," followed by nothing. The message was enough to make Marco's stomach fall. Two men in dark coats slipped past a service gate left propped open for late-night maintenance. They moved around the estate like shadows, heads down, practiced. They wore masks and gloves but carried curiosity and low light. Their plan was not to storm the house with guns blazing. It was to be surgical, take what they wanted, and go. They had been told by Blackwood to leave a message. They had been paid to make a point. Scarlett woke to a noise like paper tearing. She sat up, heart thrumming, and the nursery lights were blue with the watch chain's glow. The twins were crying, a rising rawness that made her limbs move with protective speed. She reached for one and froze. There was a noise beyond the nursery door, the soft click of a lock, and then a voice that was not Vincent's or Mrs. Chen's. She moved toward the door the way a woman makes room in herself for danger, quickly, deliberately. On the other side of the corridor, a shadow slipped past the kitchen. Scarlett's throat narrowed. She wrapped a blanket around both infants and moved like someone carrying the center of her life in her arms. Vincent's shouting came next, a word that was not a question. "Scarlett!" followed by the sound of boots. The lights flared. The house sprang awake like an animal startled in sleep. They were good at what they did. The intruders hit the security station first, scattering monitors and smashing cameras. Tony's console showed static that meant he'd been interrupted. A guard collapsed in the entryway with a different kind of quiet. A needle's dull gift pressed into his arm. The men moved like knives. Someone in the hall shouted, a garbled, unintelligible thing that meant danger and hurry. Scarlett held her children and ran, the way a mother learns to run without tripping over fear. She passed rooms she'd only just come to know, and saw the flash of a man in a mask and, behind him, another moving with an efficiency that suggested training. She reached the back door and found it barred from the outside. The panic rose in her like heat. She knew then that the house had been compromised in the way that changes everything, by the people inside it, who had turned their hands. She did not scream. The world was too loud with other sounds, boots, glass, a baby's high keening, for heroics. Instead, she tightened her grip and moved toward the kitchen, thinking of Mrs. Chen and where she might hide with the twin cradles. Someone grabbed her shoulder with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this before. A hand closed over Scarlett's mouth, but it was not rough. It was practical, no theatrics. They wanted control, not a scene. "You're hurt," the man said, voice muffled into the curve of her ear. She tasted the metallic tang of fear. They took her in the back, through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and the outdoor earth. They closed the door quietly and, because part of this operation was theater, left one small, terrible gift for Vincent. A video message sent to his personal line that began with the two small faces staring into cold light. The video showed the twins in the back of what might have been a van, bundled, their eyes wide and frightened. Scarlet, forced into frame, had her hair loose and her face streaked. The intruder did not speak much. A voice came on, smooth and controlled. "Blackwood. You thought you could hide the future," Blackwood said, camera trained like a verdict. "You left her to rot. Now you can watch what your choices cost you. You will come to the old East Dock alone. No tricks. No men. Come alone, Moretti, or you will never see them again." Vincent felt the world narrow to a single hot point. The house was a blur behind him, guards shouting, Marco red-faced and shouting commands, Mrs. Chen trying to comfort a neighbor who was more frightened than she'd ever been. The men who had burst in were competent, but Blackwood's hand was in the plan. He'd wanted spectacle. He'd wanted leverage. He had planned to humiliate Vincent by proving his inability to protect what he called his. There are moments when a man who has spent his life creating an army of options realizes none of them will help. Vincent looked at Scarlet, eyes bright, cheeks bloodless, the babies trembling against her. He saw the narrow path that had once been his oldest instinct, go to war, and he held himself back. He thought of the children who had been named after him, of a promise he had not kept, and of the new promise he had made to be present. "I'll go," he said to Blackwood's message, but he did not send anyone behind him. "I'll go alone." "Do not even think," Marco said. "You know how this works." Vincent answered with a look that had nothing in it of order. It had fear and resolve. "I didn't make this choice to save my pride," he said. "I'm going to save them." He went alone in the way a man can when he chooses to shut down every backup plan like a confession. He walked out the front door without the suit of armor that had served him his whole life. The car he took was the one he had used to arrive at the hospital days before. Plain, understated, a vehicle that would not attract attention. He moved like a man who had stepped out of one life and into another, smaller, more human one. At the East Dock, the air smelled of iron and old oil. Ships were hulks in the dark like beasts at rest. Blackwood had set the stage in a warehouse that smelled of salt and dust, the kind of place that makes the whole world feel smaller. He had men posted in the shadows, silhouettes that looked like guilt. Vincent walked inside with his hands empty. Blackwood waited beneath a hanging lamp, a cigarette burning like a smug little star between his fingers. Scarlet sat in a chair under a floodlight, flanked by two men who kept their distance. The twins were in a crate nearby, soundless except for the little gasps of sleep. "So theatrical," Vincent said. He had never liked theater. He had preferred the directness of paperwork and negotiation. "You want me to humiliate myself. You want me to prove I'm nothing without my men." Blackwood smiled like a man tasting victory. "I want you to know what it feels like to have the one thing you care about used as an instrument, to watch as someone else decides their fate. You left her. Now choose." Blackwood's terms were cruel and simple. Vincent would give up a shipment, a tactical weakness that would affect his rivalries. He would accept a bargaining chip that would humiliate him publicly, or he would lose his family. Blackwood lay out the terms with the clinical calm of a man discussing weather. For him, this was commerce. Vincent's hands clenched. The world spun. He thought of ways to solve it, calls to men who owed him favors, a rope of deception, inventiveness. Then he looked at Scarlet and saw how the light highlighted the set of her jaw, how the babies clung to the edges of sleep, oblivious to the calculus that had brought them here. "I'll do it," Vincent said. His voice was hoarse but steady. He thought he'd maybe be bargaining for time. He'd hoped to keep the children safe at any cost. Blackwood barked a small laugh. "Of course you will. But first, proof." He gave a signal. Men moved like cogs. There was a shuffle, and then the sound of a gun clicked into place behind Vincent. It was the precise, terrible sound of a life pivoting. Blackwood wanted to make him watch. He had always wanted to watch men fall. Vincent felt a hand on his shoulder, and then another, and before he could turn, there was the bite of metal and the hiss of a new arrival. The room erupted. Shots were fired, directions given. Someone smashed a crate, smoke fingered into the air like a confession. Marco moved in, not as a commander, but as a man wanting to correct a wound he had helped make. He slipped through the shadow like someone who had taken his penance and turned it into action. Men, some of Vincent's, some of Marco's own, cut through the ambush with the speed and violence of those who are used to ending plans. It was close and chaotic and imperfect. Bodies slid across concrete. Someone dragged a crate away to shield a baby. Tony, the man who had opened the gate, met a silent, deliberate end. Two of Blackwood's enforcers recognized him and shoved him aside as if he were litter. He tried to run. He was stopped and held at bay with a level of cruelty that made Vincent's stomach drop. Marco, seeing Tony's face, did not hesitate. He tackled a man who reached toward a knife and disarmed him with an urgency that felt like forgiveness and reprisal all at once. When he had the chance, Marco used the blade against one of the attackers, a wound that bled but did not kill. He would live with the bruise of that choice, and he would bear the consequences of having once obeyed orders that hurt someone he had come to care for. In the chaos, Vincent moved like someone whose whole life had led to this one, merciless second. He saw a silhouette raise a gun at Scarlett and moved without thought, like the reflex of a man whose body remembers what his heart now insists. He shoved his body between the bullet and Scarlett. The world narrowed to a single brutal shock. He felt the impact as a pressure that stole the air from him, then heat, and then a fall that made the world tilt. They pulled him up and ran him to the waiting vehicle. Scarlett screamed in a way that made the sound of the docks vanish, the cry of a woman who had been denied the right to keep her children unviolated. Marco lifted the twins and held them like a man who'd been given something holy to protect. The route back to the hospital was a blur of sirens, murmured curses, and the interior of a car that smelled of blood and antiseptic, and the small, ordinary scent of a child's blanket. At the emergency entrance, doctors moved with small, precise violence. Scarlett followed, feet pounding against linoleum, breath coming like a panic. She wanted to be at Vincent's side. Staff held her back with gentle firmness until they could release her to a surgical corridor that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The surgeons worked with a steady professionalism. The wound was not the kind anybody could will to be minor. It had pierced muscle and flayed tissue. But it had not severed anything vital outright. There was a chance, and that was what the white-coated surgeons clung to. Hours passed like a smear. Time in the weight room is an animal that eats hours alive. Scarlett sat in an anonymous chair and paid attention to everything. The clock's slow movement, the hum over the ventilation system, the way nurses slotted into a comfortable rhythm. She did not let herself imagine what she would lose. She had learned, over long months, to keep grief folded like a letter until it was time to open it. Marco came in and sat across from her like a man who had finally admitted guilt and chosen to wear it. His face was dusted with sweat and blood, small scratches at his jaw from some brief scuffle. He had protected the twins. He had bled too. He said nothing of the order he had given years ago. He had already given enough language to the fact by his presence now. "I'm sorry," he said at last, small, again and again. "I should have—" Scarlett held up a hand. She did not need apologies like medicines. She needed him to act. She needed him to be the man who prevented a repeat. "Do right now," she said. "Find out where Tony's money came from. Find Natasha's involvement. Turn over names to the people who can make them pay in a way that matters." Marco looked at her, then down at his hands. He had blood on his cuff. "I will start tonight." The world outside the hospital slowed to what it would have anyway. A police log, an incident report, men taken into custody and questioned. Blackwood's men were some taken on the scene. Others slipped away like shadows that learned to hide. The twins slept in a hospital bassinet under fluorescent lights, while Scarlett sat watching them with the kind of fierce attention that made any casual onlooker believe motherhood was a calling demoted to miracles. Vincent came out of the operating room with a pale, stunned look. He had survived. He had lost some blood and a piece of his old life, perhaps. The surgeon's face was grave but not bleak. He had done everything possible. There would be a long recovery ahead. Physical therapy for what had been damaged, the possibility of long-term pain, the uncertain probability of full mobility returned. Nothing was guaranteed. Everything had cost. When Vincent woke in a room that smelled faintly of latex and orange juice, Scarlett was there, hair pulled back, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She took his hand like someone reclaiming a thing that had been lost. For a moment, Vincent felt childish, like he'd been abandoned at the grocery and then found again. He looked at her and saw the ghost of his absence in lines he could no longer ignore. "I'm sorry," he said in a voice that had the fragile honesty of someone who had lived through too many rehearsed statements, and now had only truth. She did not answer at once. She sat very still, and then leaned forward and kissed the back of his hand like blessing. "You almost made us all die," she said, not soft. "You almost killed the only life that mattered." He listened. Her words were stones he could not avoid. He had not expected forgiveness. He had only hoped to survive long enough to deserve the chance to earn it. Recovery was an ugly, patient thing. The wound scarred and then healed, reworked tissue tightening like a mended seam. Vincent's movement would always carry the memory of that dock. He came out of the hospital with a list of things he had to do. Bandage changes, physical therapy sessions, follow-up scans, small medications that would help but not erase. The surgeons had saved him. The rest would be a negotiation between discipline and humility. The days after the attack were a crucible. Scarlett sat at the bedside while Vincent learned how to walk again, without the old gait that had been so practiced. He could not do the things he had once done with the same ease. That humbling made room for new things. Diaper changes at 3 in the morning, learning which cry meant hunger and which meant discomfort. The measured, gentle voice that told a baby stories. He learned patience by practice and the long habit of showing up. He attended physical therapy appointments while the twins slept in car seats in the waiting room. He paid nurses and therapists with the kind of attentiveness that carried a repentant conviction. Marco's redemption did not come as a speech, but as a string of actions. He turned over names of the men who had been in touch with Blackwood, worked with investigators who could convert the street-level information into prosecutable evidence, and guarded the family with the kind of zeal that was his way of trying to atone. He made a choice to walk into courts where he would testify, to sit under the glare of a light that would reveal the truth of what he had done, and to let legal consequences fall where they might. That kind of change is never neat, but it is honest. Natasha's consequence was social and financial, and eventually legal. Her alliance with Blackwood unraveled when it became clear the attack had resulted in a broader investigation. The men who had helped carry out Blackwood's plan were now evidence in a case that would not be solved by shouting alone. Natasha found herself cut off from the network she had used as leverage. She found fewer allies and more questions. Pride is an expensive currency. Blackwood himself did not vanish in a theatrical fall. He retreated at first, crowing and hurt with the kind of wounded animal pride that is never good for a plan. But the law works slowly, and men who make scenes find themselves sifted by evidence eventually. When charges from various incidents accumulated, wiretap warrants, the testimony of turned associates, a paper trail that led to financial accounts, Blackwood found his options narrow. He learned at last that humiliation and spectacle do not protect a man from the consequences of his own business. But the legal dismantling of Blackwood's network took time. It required months of testimony, subpoenas, and the grinding patience of prosecutors willing to wade through the mess. Vincent provided names, accounts, and the kind of access only someone intimately involved in the city's darker commerce could provide. In doing so, he made a choice that would mark a more significant shift than any one rescue. He began to trade in information to dismantle systems he once relied upon. He was making enemies on both sides of the ledger, but he had decided the ledger mattered less than the safety of his family. Scarlett insisted on therapy. She started with an intake that felt bureaucratic and clinical, and then discovered slowly that the work of untangling fear and anger was a map she could follow. Her nights of waking and bracing were addressed in small increments. A therapist who taught her breathing exercises, a counselor who helped her name the exact shape of each fear. She did not become whole in a month. She had months of nightmares and days when panic arrived without invitation. But she also began to practice forgiveness in the most strenuous way, by building boundaries, learning to trust action over words, and claiming a life for herself that included but was not defined by Vincent. The months that followed were quiet and loud in alternating measures. They were full of mundane visits and surprising small victories. The first time Leo said a word that could be understood as "da." The first time Luna reached for Vincent's face with both hands. They were full of legal filings and interviews, of men on the stand, and others quietly flipping sides to avoid prosecution. Marco took his seat in a courtroom and told the truth. He took the consequences and watched his name be rearranged into something that could be forgiven only with time and labor. He came to the house less arrogant and more direct, and Vincent watched him like someone cataloging proof that people can, sometimes, choose a better path. Vincent also made changes in the way he ran his life. He hired managers who operated legitimate businesses in his stead. He closed accounts that were sinks for petty violence. He signed documents with lawyers to disentangle holdings that facilitated illicit payments. Some people called it a retirement from old ways. Others called it an attempt to launder guilt with new contracts. For Vincent, it was more honest than that. It was the painful, steady work of dismantling the things that could hurt his family again. He feared exposure, of course. To step away from ways that had long defined him was to surrender tools that had once kept him safe. But each day he chose his children over the empire he had once built. There were practical things that showed his shift more than speeches ever could. He set up a trust in the twins' names that made it difficult for shadow money to touch their future. He took responsibility for all the debts Scarlett had carried alone, and made arrangements that never drew her into a public show. He spent mornings at the house, learning the rhythm of breakfast chaos, learning to value a life measured by small routines. He accompanied Scarlett to therapy appointments and sat in the waiting rooms doing the dishes so she could have space. He asked how to be better, and then did, again and again. The family moved to the suburbs 6 months later, a modest house with a small front yard, and a swing set where Vincent pushed the twins in the kind of space that had once been unimaginable to him. The move was deliberate. Distance from the city's glare, a chance at privacy, an opportunity to build a life not predicated on towers and suits, but on front porches and school runs. He traded big cars for something simpler. He learned to cook a dish that made the children giggle. He learned the names of parent-teacher meeting coordinators. He learned to be unremarkable in the way that proves you are present. Scarlett returned to work part-time at first, then full-time. She had always been a competent person. Now she was a person with the support she had once lacked. She took a job that paid enough to let her stand with dignity, and Vincent refused to stand between her and her agency. He paid what he had to pay, yes, but he also insisted she be the one to choose when and how to use the resources. He sat through long conversations about autonomy and the ways in which money can masquerade as control. He often lost arguments in the way that men who try to repair relationships do, clumsy, honest, earnest. As the months warmed into a spring that felt like recovery in sunlight, Vincent made another small human mistake. He fell in love with the everyday. He loved how Scarlett hummed when she loaded dishes. He loved how she scolded Leo for scribbling on a wall he had yet to understand. He loved the way Luna would curl like a comma on the sofa. The love he now felt was not the dramatic, possessive thing of before. It was a steady, earning thing. Confession, then action. Apology, then presence. One evening, on a late spring walk along a small path behind their house, Vincent stopped under a low maple and pulled a small box from his pocket. It was not expensive. It needn't be. It was a ring he'd chosen after sitting with the idea of what it would mean to ask for a life with consequences he would accept. "Scarlett," he said, voice small under the tree. The twins ran ahead and then turned back, their hands sticky with the remains of a popsicle. "I know I don't deserve this without a long list of proof. I know the right to ask for this is not earned overnight, but I want to ask you anyway." She looked at him the way she looked at a broken thing she could fix if she chose. Careful, mild, and skeptical. "You mean it's not an order?" she said, a faint smile. "No," he said. "It's not an order." She took the box and opened it with a steadiness that had been carved into her by the grind of surviving. She looked at him and back at the ring and closed the box again. "I don't want to be the thing that saves you from yourself," she said. "I also don't want to pretend the past didn't happen. If you ask me," she slowed, finding the language for conditions she could live with, "ask like you mean it. Ask knowing that I will say yes because of what you do every day, not because you had a dramatic moment." He swallowed, throat moving like a man who had done 100 hard things now trying to do one more. "I promise to prove it," he said. "In the laundry, in the mornings, in the lawyers' offices, in the small ways." She looked at him. There was a silence that felt like a hinge swinging open. Then she said yes, not because she believed instantly that everything would be fine, but because she had watched him change and would watch him again. They did not stage a ring and kiss moment like a hired scene. They sat on a park bench and let the twins climb over them, and the ring glinted and meant something small and incandescent. There was another small test of their mended life when Scarlett discovered she was pregnant. It was not dramatic. A missed period, a careful appointment, a scan that showed a small, improbable heartbeat. For days they both held the secret like something fragile. Pregnancy after the chaos of their early months together felt like a promise and a threat at once. It meant more love to protect, more possible vulnerability. It meant a new life entirely. Vincent understood the stakes in a way he never had before, not as empire, but as parent. They told the twins by letting them in on the secret slowly, drawing pictures at the table, pointing at the small ultrasound photo taped to the fridge. Leo stuck his thumb in his mouth and then pressed a tentative hand to the curve of Scarlett's abdomen as if greeting a friend. Luna, younger but eager, wanted to sing to the bump already. Months rolled on. Blackwood's empire dwindled as his men turned on him and evidence mounted. He was arrested in a move that was less spectacular than many expected. a slow accumulation of indictments, and the weight of men who could no longer lie. Natasha slunk away to a life that had fewer parties and less influence. She found, to her consternation, that the city is smaller without allies. Tony faced charges for his role. Marco's name took a beating in court, but was ultimately softened by his cooperation and the tangible acts he had made to protect the family. He began to work for legitimate security firms under supervision and gave talks about the cost of blind obedience, which was both redemption and penance in the public eye. The last scene that matters, the one that anchors a life in the choices it makes, wasn't dramatic. It was a Thursday morning when Vincent pushed the twins on the swings at a park that smelled of cut grass and spilled coffee. Scarlett watched them together, hair pulled into a loose knot, cheeks flushed. Leo laughed at Vincent's exaggerated faces. Luna squealed with delight when Vincent pretended the sky was an angry monster who only loved hugs. They were ordinary, messy, real. Vincent had scars that echoed when the weather turned cold, a reminder of the dock and the bullet that had changed his life. He also had a new set of habits. He learned to go to school plays, to sit in parent meetings, to let a crying child be more important than an incoming phone call. He had rebuilt his life on the slow, halting rituals of care. Scarlett taught him how to fold tiny sweaters, how to choose better words when anger flared, how to insist upon therapy when the nights ended badly. He paid for care but did not purchase her choices. He apologized when he slipped and made room when she needed distance. He was not perfect, none of them were. But the house had been rebuilt into something that was not an estate of fear, but a home for small celebrations. The Moretti name still existed in the city's ledger, but Vincent began closing chapters that tied his family's fate to the ruins of his old empire. One afternoon, years after the crosswalk that had started everything, Scarlett walked across a small suburban street with a stroller. A man walking by glanced, then laughed at the tiny war of fingers across the stroller hood, a dog yapping, a baby fussing. Nobody in that moment had any idea of the histories trying to knit themselves into a new life. The city's light still glowed in a distant skyline, but here the light was local. Porch lights, lamps, the soft spill of a neighbor's music. A woman with a stroller looked tired but content, carrying 2 responsibilities and 1 surprise inside her. Vincent watched her from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, 2 small children playing at his feet. He did not watch like a man measuring power. He watched like a man learning the vocabulary of ordinary love. He thought of how many things he had lost and gained, of how impossible it was that the same hands that had ordered disappearances could now hold an infant with an awkward tenderness. Scarlett caught his eye and gave a small smile, a thing that had once been a missile and was now a small bridge. She had earned the right to that smile through millions of tiny decisions. He had earned, and continued to earn, the right to be looked at with trust in her eyes. They had been laughed at once, at a crosswalk, by people who saw only a tired woman with 2 small bundles. They had been invisible to the city's indifferent crowd. What the crowd didn't know then was what time and choice could do. How a man could trade an empire for a life. How a woman could insist on dignity and protect her children. How betrayal could lead to penance, and how violence could be met with the stubborn, literate force of slow, legal consequence. The most dangerous man in the city had learned how to be dangerous for his family, and nothing else. He worked to make amends until it no longer mattered whether anyone else believed in his redemption. He kept proving it in the mornings. Scarlett's smile was not naivete. It was a compromise between hope and the scars she kept close. They had not erased the past. They had folded it into a life where the soft domestic moments had become the real measure of power. On an ordinary evening, as the sun slid thin and gold over the edge of town, Vincent watched Leo and Luna and the small child who would come to meet them in months, and he felt, with a clarity that kept him awake and kind, that some things were worth more than empires. Daily vows kept, little hands held, the decision to be there when someone woke in the night. He breathed in the hum of suburban lights and let the noise of his old life fall away. If this story of second chances moved you, share it with someone who believes people can change. Leave a comment. Would you grant the man who left, who hurt you, a real second chance if he proved himself every day?